Hello, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world with us today. And happy holidays as we enter the holiday season. And for many parts of the world, we have already entered those holiday seasons. Today's webinar is going to be about smart syncing versus excessive cloning. Smart syncing versus excessive cloning. So without much ado, let's just get into this and what we'll be covering today. Obviously, we're going to cover introductions. I will cover a little bit about my background and so forth. Then we'll get into the actual challenges that are involved with instance inconsistencies within your ServiceNow ecosystem or landscape. We'll then walk through the benefits of synchronizing the instances and kind of a best practice map of what that could and perhaps even should look like at your organization to overcome the challenges that we will set forth and discuss here. And then at the end of this, I'll take your questions. We'll do some answers and we'll make it a wrap. So real quickly, just about myself, I am the head of product marketing here at X-Type, but I'm also a technologist. The short of the long of my career is I started the first half of my career basically was a software engineer. And I wrote software for virtually every vertical, whether it was financial services, government contractors, manufacturing, you name it. I have had experience writing code in those environments. And then fast forward throughout my career, I basically moved from writing the code to some experience selling the code. I then ran a global services organization where I then implemented said code or other people's code. And then now here I am in marketing. So basically I've got the full life cycle experience when it comes to applications, software, and IT. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about our topic for today. We're going to cover ServiceNow instances, inconsistencies, and the challenges that they pose. So what I have here is just a simple graph, of course, that or graphic that is showing you three environments. I got a dev environment, testing environment, and a production environment. And you can see these little dots, these colored dots. These are representing your update sets, your scoped apps, your store apps, plugins, what have you. And as you can see already out of the gate, obviously there are some differences. We would expect there to be because I'm making changes in my dev instance, and perhaps production has something there, a different version that's in dev or what have you. But of course, what occurs as we get into here? Well, ultimately, I'm going to migrate a change that I make, an update set in dev or an app, and I'm going to move it into testing where I can then, of course, obviously test. But it turns out when I make that migration, there might be a conflict or an error, a preview error. So I'm going to have to make some additional changes to allow that update or that app or plugin to work correctly. And that denotes a change that now does not exist in my dev environment, certainly doesn't exist in production yet as well. But we want to move to production. So what are we going to do? We're going to go ahead and make a clone of production. Now, I have my pre-prod environment looks just like production, and I want to migrate everything in test because all my changes, my updates, my features, they have passed all of my tests, my test framework executions and so forth. So I move them over. But of course, as I move them over to here, since testing is not production-like, I've now run into, of course, perhaps some other challenges, conflicts, preview errors, whatever. I make the appropriate troubleshooting resolution steps here, but then this denotes a change that, as you can see, with that really amber dot, that it doesn't exist in any of the other environments. But I'll go ahead and migrate these, the original payload that was intended to move forward. I will move that. And then what I'm denoting here is that over time, there's just a collection of changes that seem to occur. The simple scenario I'd laid out here just plays itself out over time, including the lime green dot I put into production to represent, well, perhaps I had to install a hotfix in production to fix a production issue, right? The point is that none of these instances now look alike. And if I have multiple development environments where I've got federated development going on, this exacerbates even further still. So what you can now see is that none of my instances are production-like. Now, this is significant, as we'll get into of why that is a problem. But first of all, how do we traditionally or typically try to solve this? Well, the answer is, well, since my instances don't look all alike, then I will just clone my way out of the problem. But it turns out cloning is not an effective strategy to solve this problem, because no one is really considering the total cost of the cloning. So if I'm going to do a clone, I've actually got a lot of work in progress that I have to now identify. I have to go through and find all the things that do not exist in my production environment or the model that I'm cloning. I then have to export all of that work. Then we can perform the clone. And when the clone is going to take however it takes, right? ServiceNow, their cloning process takes what it takes. Many of the customers we deal with say it can take anywhere from 10 hours to 24 hours, 30 hours. But whatever, you run that part of this process overnight or over the weekend, whatever. But the point is, the next morning or after the weekend, your developers and your administrators come in, that clone is not ready for new work. You now have to import the work in progress that you exported. And then, of course, you're going to have to make the appropriate troubleshooting and remediation steps to ensure that everything that got imported actually works. But that's not all. So what you do to do this is you have a spreadsheet like I'm showing here as you identify all the work that has to be exported and then imported, you'll make a spreadsheet here. But the problem is the spreadsheets are error prone, right? You may have accidentally missed an update set. So maybe after you do all your imports, you check around, you look, everything looks okay in the new clone, but then you realize, oh, I actually skipped one. So you go back to the old instance before you blow it away and you export, import. The point is, again, we've learned from our ServiceNow customers is that this simple process for one instance, this re-import, troubleshooting, identification, all of this can take 3 or more hours per instance to perform. And if you multiply that across all the instances that you've now cloned, this becomes a lot of work. In fact, it's just not even that it's amount of work. It means that while that work is going on to make your newly cloned instances development ready, developers are not coding because they don't have an instance to work into, right? So they're not coding. So that's a huge productivity loss, not to mention the potential risk for losing work here, as it's may or may not be identified in your spreadsheet. So how does instance synchronization work? Well, let's take a look at it, how it applies as far as Xtype and what Xtype is actually doing in your environment. So you see here, I've got it all laid out. I got a dev environment, QA, pre-prod, prod. Maybe you're using Jira. So I've represented that here where you're tracking your changes. And perhaps you're also using an app repository, or you're even using a ServiceNow Application Engine Studio, the App Engine Management Center. But either way, doesn't matter. You would install Xtype. It's a product, it's an app on all of your instances. And what it now immediately gives you right out of the gate, it takes just minutes to install this thing. Okay, this is not very difficult, but when it does, you get multi-environment visibility. So all those differences I was showing you before, Xtype will show you what all those differences are. So when it comes to cloning, one of the things Xtype then can provide with this multi-environment visibility is it can help you very quickly identify all that work in progress. In other words, all the things, all of like your update sets that are complete or in progress, and you can quickly get that list and now go appropriately export them. There's no guessing. You're not manually going to identify these. Xtype makes the identification process instantaneously. Then comes the controlled synchronization. Now we call it controlled because you control how the synchronization works. We'll get to that in the best practice in a moment, but you can have these update sets be synchronized with application test framework executions, code scans, approvals if you want them. You control how that synchronization works. But it's also, we've referred to it like in this webinar, smart synchronization, because those remediation steps you are taking to ensure, let's say, an update set works in its target instance, resolving a preview error, for example, or a conflict. Xtype is remembering those. steps, and it'll then replicate those steps in any instance where it is now migrating the update that was pushed into the target instance. And we'll get into that in a second. If we can go backwards, we can go forwards as well. So we can do your zero touch deployments forward, and we can synchronize them backward, or rather deploy them automatically downstream and synchronize them upstream in your pipeline. And then the other thing X-Type is doing is providing release packaging. So I'd mentioned before, when it comes to cloning, X-Type can provide instantaneous identification of the work that needs to be exported. Well, since it's in all of your instances, as I'm showing here, and it knows where everything is, and it can identify what the differences is, then when it comes to your production releases, what X-Type provides is a package that allows you to just point and click, drag and drop your way into that list of that release payload. You don't have to use spreadsheets anymore, which are error prone and take you a lot of time. You just simply go from QA, point and click, or your pre-prod instance, point and click, drag and drop order all of the various assets that need to move forward, and that payload can be moved forward by schedule or changed, tied to a change ticket. Which gets me to the last step. All of this can be associated and integrated with your change release process, so that ServiceNow is still your system of record for your releases. But let's take a look at a use case for synchronization. As any change goes into any of these instances, what X-Type is going to do, is you're going to see, is it not only migrates it forward, but it can actually migrate this stuff backward as well. So that now all the instances are going to be as production-like as possible. Now, I'd mentioned before, one of the key challenges is with this that I was going to talk to you about later, I want to talk about now. If I'm in my development instance and I'm coding the next feature request that's coming from the business or an app or whatever it is, I'm actually making those changes in an instance that is not production-like. What that means is I am baking problems into my code right out of the gate. So the minute I migrate that update set or that app to the next instance, since the next instance is also not production-like and it definitely not development-like, then I am bound to have preview errors or conflicts that are going to have to be resolved. And if not in QA, definitely I'm going to have these issues by the time I move to pre-prod and certainly into production. So what I'm doing is I'm baking in all that extra time that is going to have to happen. And it's going to be replicated over and over again, right? I will probably go through those steps in pre-prod, and inevitably I will run through those exact same steps in the prod. That's a huge productivity suck, right? And then secondly, the other problem is when I'm solving these issues and resolving these conflicts and preview errors in production, that's perhaps weeks away from when I actually wrote and developed and created that feature set, right? That update set. So now that adds a cognitive load to your development staff that now have to go back, what I call into the Wayback Machine, and try to remember, oh yeah, what was it that we were doing and why was that issue? How did we resolve that? And they have to go in the Wayback Machine because they're not sitting on their thumbs while you're waiting for production release. They've now moved on to the next set that's got to go be pumped forward. So what synchronization then does is it takes any changes made by any developer or any admin that's made an instance, and it shifts the problem resolution process and the conflict and preview error, it shifts it all left, so that now your development staff can resolve those issues at the point of innovation, not at the point of release or migration, but at the point of innovation. That means if in a conflict or a preview error even occurs, since you're synchronizing so quickly, you may not even have these issues to begin with. But if you do, the developers in the mode of making the changes, they're in the best place possible to resolve those issues in the shortest amount of time possible. And then that now means is that the features that they're producing and shipping via update sets or scoped apps, or what have you, are now going to be moving clean as they move forward. So now they can very quickly move to QA and be tested against, where you're actually looking for errors, not these kinds of troubles and things. So your changes actually move clean all the way through to production. So the benefits, I kind of touched on those, but we're going to enumerate them here. I've counted at least 5 when we talk about controlled synchronization. One of the key benefits is that now all of your production, all of your instances are as production-like as possible. So that means you don't have to clone as often. I'm not saying you don't have to clone. You have to clone, right? At least the minimally required amount of times per year. That's just the nature of the ServiceNow architecture and ecosystem, and that's not a bad thing. Okay, that's just the way it is. But what Xtype is going to do for you is mean that you only have to clone when you actually have to, when there's actually need to do it. You're not cloning to resolve this problem, because all of your production instances look as production-like as possible without cloning. Then your features, your update sets, your scoped apps, what have you, are able to be clean as they get migrated downstream to production. So this has the impact of reducing the number of errors that you're going to experience in migration, which reduces the amount of time that is spent troubleshooting and resolving those issues. So this is a huge productivity uplift. It also will shorten the amount of time it takes for your production releases. It improves the update set propagation, as I've already talked about. Your update sets, your scoped apps are able to move clean now. They're not, you have less of a chance of them having preview errors and conflicts, because again, all of your instances look as nearly similar as possible. It improves the compatibility of this code, as I mentioned again before. So now that they have a clean path to production, the likelihood of experiencing errors, conflicts, preview errors, and what have you goes way down. As I mentioned before, you're actually shifting left those the resolution of preview errors and conflicts, so that developers are making these changes when they are in the best position possible to know them and quick solve them as fast as possible. So you've shift resolution to the point of innovation and not to the point of propagation. And then lastly, by using synchronization, you are shortening the mean time to clone readiness, meaning the amount of time it takes for a new clone to be ready for new development. Xtype can reduce this by 5 to 8 times the amount of time it takes. Zurich Insurance, a very public reference for us. You can go look at the recording of their testimonial and our webinar with them, but they have told the story how that import process I was telling you about took about 3 hours per instance, multiplied by the number of instances they had. It was going to take their people 24 hours or 3 working days to accomplish that work. That would be 3 days with developers not having access to an environment to code on. That's a huge productivity hit, right? I mean, no wonder your backlogs grow if you got 3 days every month or every whenever when they can't code. Using Xtype, they reduced that 3 days down to 3 hours. So within the same day the clones were ready, developers were able to work on those brand new, newly cloned instances. And of course, let's take a look at a best practice here. Let me lay out a scenario here for you. So we've got a dev environment with a bunch of dev instances, as we already mentioned before, and you can see the diagram here. Well, obviously you're migrating things to your QA environment, or integrated test system happening here. This is a key point and a very obvious thing. You would want all of those changes that are going into your integrated test instance as designed here, that they're propagated back to all the other developer instances. This way, the developers are their instance is constantly being updated with the new information, right? So as every developer is writing their particular update sets or scoped apps or what have you, and they mark it as complete or ready for deployment, this immediately gets migrated to the other developers' instances. This now allows the developers at the point of innovation to resolve any conflicts or errors, and then means that those updates are going to move cleanly to, as I'm designing here, a UAT instance, where now you can have your automated test frameworks execute and code scanning and so forth. And the same will be true for your staging instance and on to production. That clean path has now been made for you. But I also want to highlight that what can also be done is your production instance. There are times when you might put a hot fix in production. So what we would recommend you to consider is to allow the synchronization to go back one way, of course, from production, so that if there is a hot fix or some plugin or something that has to be done in your production instance, that those changes can be migrated backwards or migrated upstream as well. Because the benefit of doing this now is that now developers' instances look as production-like as possible, and they're writing the innovations with that information. So they have a high probability of whatever they have written is actually going to work by the time it gets into production. There are fewer surprises when you go to production. So this is just a roadmap. Obviously, when you install X-Type and you work with us, we'll provide you a good best practice that will match your instance. But you shouldn't be too nervous here, because as I mentioned here, we call this capability in X-Type controlled synchronization. This is because you can control if it synchronizes back or not. It can be triggered by an approval. Once the change is made, for example, in production, it can be flagged so that somebody can approve that migration upstream. Or it can have that and maybe run your automated test framework tests, so that nothing as bad is being propagated backwards or even forward for that matter. But definitely, as you synchronize, all those same checks you would expect to be made as you migrate forward could also be done synchronizing backwards. So in summary, there are many, many symptoms and pain points that we experience with instance inconsistencies. It could be a growing undeployed backlog. I mean, this is just a subtle thing, but the productivity hit you take by cloning and troubleshooting things from developing and production, unlike instances, really can help you grow that backlog, something you don't want to do. Your ServiceNow teams want to and should be able to respond to the business demand, as we say, at the speed of now. So you can have a slower pace of innovation, and then of course you're cloning more than you really have to clone. As I already mentioned before, cloning is not an effective strategy to overcome instance inconsistencies, right? Synchronization is a better strategy for this. You're not eliminating cloning, but you're reducing it to the bare minimum that you have to do. Keeping the environments as production-like as possible, as I keep reiterating, reduces the need for cloning and improves delivery throughput, because there's now a clean path for those innovations you make in dev going forward. Or to put it in other words, is a high probability that as they are migrated downstream, ultimately to production, that they will not experience preview errors or conflicts or what have you. Not that they won't ever, but you've really dropped down the likelihood of those occurring. And of course, this will ultimately lead to improved productivity, and you reduce the risk of lost work or errors or your production releases taking longer than planned. So lastly here, just a quick thing about X-Type, and we'll open it up to some questions. I'll stop sharing here in a moment here, is that X-Type, we're the de facto standard for ServiceNow platform engineering. We have a global team of specialists. X-Type was born global, we could say. We provide purpose-built products that run natively on the ServiceNow platform. Okay, these aren't integrations, they are apps that run on the ServiceNow platform. We have an app on the ServiceNow store. It is certified. You can download it for free. It's called X-Type View. Go get it, play around with it, and see some of the benefits you can get. That app does not do the synchronization, but it will provide you with some multi-environment visibility, and you'll get a sample of the kinds of things that X-Type can do for you. And we're happy to serve you, and our customers are frankly in love with us. So with that, let me just open it up to some questions, and we'll make this a wrap. So first question I have here is, why doesn't regular cloning resolve environment consistencies? Couldn't you just clone faster? So I already covered this, but very quickly, as I already mentioned, because we're running out of time, we kind of covered that. Cloning takes a long time. It's a significant investment in time, not for the cloning process it takes. There are strategies for that, as I already mentioned, running them overnight over the weekends, but it's the pre and post clone work that can really nip you in the tail end as far as productivity. Last question here. Do you have to have X-Type installed on all the instances for synchronization to work? Well, the simple answer to this is Yes, any instance where you want synchronization to occur, X-Type would need to be there because it's the one that's doing everything we just mentioned. Now, I should say this synchronization, as well as our zero touch deployment, it's actually using the native migration capabilities within ServiceNow. So X-Type's not doing anything magic or crazy there. We're actually using the pre-approved and trusted process that you're already familiar with today. We've just put a little bit of smarts around it and putting together some automation around it to make it more streamlined. And yeah, that's it. So if you have any more questions, please come and visit us at xtype.io. We have lots of videos, ebooks, and other things you can go look at and learn more about us. And with that, we hope you have a great afternoon and have a very safe and enjoyable holiday season. Thank you.